Hello, folks. We are still continuing the series about getting to know me as a person. Hello, my name is Shelton Zia. I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I have been going through a series where I talk about myself, who I am, what my background is. I feel like it's important, right? People want to know who you are, what your training is, what do you know, what have you experienced, and are you a person? Does your background resonate with mine? Are you a person who I want to listen to? And so I always feel like transparency is important, so that we can get in unity and one accord about what it is that we are trying to accomplish. So I wanted to share my background a little bit. In my previous videos, I talked about my testimony and how I came to Christ. In this video, I want to talk about my background, particularly as it relates to my academic training and how it is that I came to do the work that I do currently. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist as well as a community psychologist, and I obtained my Ph.D. from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Shout out to the Ravens. I grew up in Zimbabwe. So I was born in the 80s and grew up in Zimbabwe. And if anybody knows their history and their geography, Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980. During that time, my dad was also coming of age, was one of the first Black people to obtain his bachelor's, one of the first Black people to obtain his bachelor's degree from the University of Zimbabwe. And so he was immediately thrust very fast into a position of leadership and authority, and worked in the Zimbabwean police force and was the assistant commissioner of police until he transitioned from the police force and went into the government sector, where he worked as the director of central purchasing and supply. I don't know, something to do with supplies for the government, okay? And he was the director of that. All of that context is important because it informs my background and my upbringing in Zimbabwe, in the upper class of that society. So my social class was wealthy, and my parents were pretty well off and provided all of the things, right? And so my story is actually quite reverse from most people, where I came from Zimbabwe and experienced a downgrade in social class, whereas most people who are immigrating are coming here for a better life. So what made you come over here? Well, a series of things, but I don't know that it matters so much for this part of the story, but needless to say, I found myself here. My parents also ended up immigrating to the UK. And so my folks live in the UK and I lived over here. A few years into, I came to attend university at a small HBCU in East Texas called Wiley College. Shout out to the great debaters in Marshall, Texas. So really small town. And I attended school there for about a year and a half. And then I transferred and went to Michigan State because my major at the time was hotel and restaurant management, which is what all Zimbabweans study, because tourism is a big thing back home, and somehow everybody's expected to go into that. Interestingly, during the time I was at Michigan State, the Zimbabwean economy did a thing, and so my parents lost a lot of their fortune, and gave me a call and says that you're on your own. Obviously, it wasn't quite as simple, but that's basically what the gist of it was that we cannot pay for your tuition or send you money anymore, figure it out. And so here I am, sophomore in college in Michigan, like, what do I do? So I was dating my college sweetheart at the time. We eventually got married and then divorced, but we were dating at the time, and he says, well, why don't you come over here? And he was in Texas at the time. Figure it out, and then you can head on back. So I moved to Texas to be over there for a semester while I figured out my finances and could come back to school to complete my degree. Needless to say, I never went back. Okay, that's the moral of the story. I did not go back to Michigan. Okay, I ended up being in Texas and working actually at a hospital, a burn hospital called the Shriners Burn Hospital for Kids, doing research. And it was a series of fortunate events that led to me getting this job as a research assistant in a lab, doing like cutting edge research at the time. And I'm pretty sure still is, because that was pretty revolutionary stuff that we were doing. But it was because my ex-husband played rugby with the people that played rugby with, it was like he was in this rugby team, and the director of that lab was connected. Like somehow I was able to get an interview. Okay, I was able to apply for the job, get an interview, and get in. Okay, shout out to Arnie Ferrando and Tara and all of those people back then. So I got a job as a research assistant, and it was funny because God's favor works that way, but I was making more money than the other people in the same position that had degrees. But that's because my position was specially developed because they needed people that came in the evenings and on weekends. And I'm like 20, I was not doing anything else. Okay. And I can come in whenever you want me to. And so that was interesting, but I learned those things really fast, and I was really good at my job, and folks took notice. Whenever the medical doctors were going to do presentations at conferences, and they needed to understand what the research and the science behind the work that we were doing, they would come to me and I would teach them and explain it to them so that they would then go and present at these conferences. What? And so a lot of them would say, wow, you're really smart. You should go to medical school. Oh, well, I would draw circles in the sand with my toes and give a story about, the way, whatever, right? But I did keep hearing that enough times that it told me that, okay, maybe I could do something. Maybe I got a little something to offer in that regard. And I remember even being offered several jobs to run people's labs. And then they would find out that I don't have a degree, and they'd go, what? They'd be like, mind blown. And it'd be like, wow, this job actually requires a master's. But that's how favor and grace works, right? And so I didn't go on to take those positions. And long story short, I did decide that I was going to go back to school and wanted to study nursing and eventually go to medical school. But in 2008, Hurricane Ike blew through Galveston, and we left Galveston and ended up in Maryland because my ex-husband's parents lived there. And so we ended up in Maryland, and we were trying to rebuild our lives and figure out where do we go next. At that time, my husband at the time joined the Navy. So 5 years into our marriage, he decided to join the Navy. And then I was like, you know what? This is as good a time as any to go back to school. So I decided to go back to school because I wanted to be a doctor. And I went to apply for college in January, in the spring of 2009. And when I was going to apply at universities at Shady Grove, if anybody knows the DMV universities at Shady Grove in Rockville, has 9 universities represented, the University of Maryland system represented at that campus. And so I went over there and was going to study biology. So I wanted to take biology, pre-med biology. And when I arrived, they said, oh, biology is, the deadline has already passed for that. And, so you'd have to start next academic year. But if you go upstairs, I think psychology might still be taking students. And so I decided to go upstairs. because she was so helpful. Gloria Calotra, I actually won't ever forget her. She was so helpful. I was like, okay, I'll go upstairs because she's been so nice. But I kind of was like, man, I don't know. I ought to just leave. And I turned around and she was like peering to see that I made it to the stairs. So I had to go upstairs. I had to go upstairs. So I go upstairs and I was like, you know what? I'll just go up there and then just walk the hall and then turn back around and then just scurry on out. But when I got upstairs, Sonia Crosby's door was open, and wouldn't you know, she was the intake person for, UMBC. Why? What are the chances? And so she's like, hi. I'm like, oh, hello. I'm looking for psychology. She's like, oh, yes, it's right here. And I was like, oh, okay. And so she's explaining to me and giving me all the information. I'm like, yes. And then I was going to just take the information and say, yeah, I'll sign up online, and maybe not, right? But she said to me, if you register for classes right now, I'll waive the registration fee. And I had no way to decline. I had used all of my excuses possible, and so I just was like, okay. So that's how I ended up majoring in psychology. It was just because I couldn't say no. My people-pleasing ways. Oh my goodness. Every time I tell that story, people are just like, what? I'm like, I know. I wasn't trying to study psychology. But I ended up studying psychology because of a series of just random events. So I enrolled to a number of different classes, a couple of psychology classes and a sociology class, and I take classes, and I took a child development psychology class, and remember just being in there, mind utterly blown. What is this? I didn't know what psychology was. You know what? Let me not say that, because I did take an intro to psychology class at Wiley, but to me, it was just a series of random classes that have nothing to do with my major, which is hotel and restaurant management. Why are they making me do religion? So I was actually quite resentful when I was taking those classes as a freshman at Wiley, and probably just wasn't even engaged. I remember Miss Thomas was actually the psych professor at Wiley, which I don't know why I remember that, but I wasn't engaged. But now I'm here learning child development, and maybe it's because I had kids, right? And so now it matters. It applies to something. I'm going, wait a minute. And now I'm applying it to even my own upbringing and my own childhood. And mind is just blown. I'm having realization after realization. I said, oh, this is my major. That same semester, I changed my major. I also took a race and ethnicity course, and that professor was teaching about racism and all of the what it means to be Black in America. And that was also the first time I was now fully understanding what my experience had been as a Black person in America, because mind you, coming from Zimbabwe, we are Black majority. So your race isn't actually the thing that you think about as it relates to your identity. It's actually a social class, right? More than anything, it's your level of education, the job that you do, the neighborhood you live in, who do you know, who are you connected to, not your race. So I came to America, discovered I was Black, but didn't know what that meant, and didn't really have the tools to navigate that, because I never received an understanding or education of what that is. And I remember coming to that realization in that class, and I said to the professor, my kids, what am I gonna do? It was this realization that I'm raising Black kids, and it's just so, oh no. And then he says, well, there's a concept called racial socialization. Oh, okay. Why don't you write your paper on that? Okay, Got it. So I go and I write my paper on racial socialization and learned what it means to teach Black children what it is to be Black in America. Okay. Do you know that I was now going through my own racial socialization at my big age in my 20s, late 20s? We talk about racial socialization as a thing that we teach children using age appropriate terms as they develop, right? And so you typically would start that while they're toddlers and in kindergarten and then elementary school and so forth. And the lessons become more sophisticated as they grow and develop their racial identity. I developed my racial identity in my late 20s and 30s. And I developed my racial identity as I was teaching my children their racial identity. So what I ended up doing was making just about every paper that I wrote about the Black experience. So if I'm taking a class on interviewing, I'm applying it somehow to the African American experience. If I'm taking a class about this, I'm applying it somehow to discrimination, just so I could fully apprehend it. And in doing so, I really made my bachelor's degree the sort of foundation and the groundwork for what I would then later on do. So then I decide, okay, I want to get a PhD because everybody knows you can't do anything with a bachelor's degree in psychology. You almost have to go to grad school, master's or PhD. So PhD, of course. And fortunately, I had a mentor at that time who guided me and supported me through the application process, as well as really identifying what my profile is going to look like, and did a phenomenal job. Got an interview at University of Maryland, College Park, but tanked that interview for a bunch of different reasons, but needless to say, ended up not getting in. So then what I end up doing is going to my plan B and applying for a master's program at Loyola. So there's a Loyola, Maryland, University of Loyola, Maryland in Baltimore that I applied to and did a master's in clinical psychology, research focused track. I chuckle because it was a really grueling experience. I mean, I was taught research methods and statistics by Dr. Martin Sherman, who does not play, okay, about research. And we used to jokingly call him the gatekeeper of science. And so if you want to know what it's like to go through that experience, just like imagine a gatekeeper who ain't trying to let y'all in. Okay. And so I had a really tough time passing the comprehensive exam. So now we're in year 2. Had a hard time passing the comprehensive exams and had to retake it. And I'm going, geez, what is going on? Needless to say, we're now in year 2 of my master's program. I go on and I apply to a PhD program again. This time, I've done a little more research and developing my identity as a researcher who really cares about Black issues and really what we now call racial trauma. At that time, we weren't calling it racial trauma. We were calling it perceived discrimination. I got things to say about that, but let's stay focused. And so I'm learning about racial trauma and how people cope. So my focus was on resilience factors. How do people overcome hardships such as racial trauma? All right, I bet y'all can already tell where this is going. My master's thesis was focused on how Black women cope with racial trauma and comparing African Americans and Caribbean Americans, as well as how spirituality aids in coping, as well as locus of control. My goodness. And so when you're thinking of locus of control, you're thinking about my own ability to accomplish and to overcome, the extent to which I believe that I can overcome something, that I believe that it is in my control. So having an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control. And then looking at spirituality, And interestingly, I learned the difference between religiosity and spirituality during that project, right? So when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about a transcendent relationship with God. When we're talking about religiosity, we're talking about belonging to an institution and practicing the behaviors associated with that institution. So that is prayer, going to church, participating in Bible study, and all of those behaviors. So religiosity is more about the behaviors. Spirituality is about the internal state. All right. I don't know why I went into that. My master's. That was my master's. Okay. I loved it. It was great. And interestingly enough, the issue of racial socialization came back again. What's happening? Well, I had hypothesized that Caribbean Americans would cope better with discrimination than African Americans. For no other reason than just picking. I just picked that. I could have said African Americans would cope better. I just said Caribbeans. Anyway, the findings ended up indicating that demonstrating that African Americans cope better with discrimination than Caribbean Americans. And in my discussion, I identified racial socialization, right, as the tool that teaches African Americans from the jump who they are, how to navigate the systems here in America. So it's like, wow, this thing keeps coming back, right? And then empowerment. So also talking about empowerment, like, right, implications for future research, implications for treatment, implications for programs, is developing empowerment programs for women that even if they haven't been racially socialized as children, they can still receive empowerment in adulthood. So now can you see how the whole locus of control and empowerment narrative came about for me? And so, all right, so here I'm still battling it out with Sherman. Ain't trying to let me pass the comps. And I went ahead and applied for a PhD program and got in. Sorry, that pause was too long. There was a little sting in that and got in, but it was almost poetic justice for me. Because here I am, this person who is the gatekeeper of science over here will not let me pass, but I still got into a PhD program. So you know what? You good. You got it. Nah, you got it. I'm out. And folks was shook. What? You're in a PhD program? What? Y'all don't know me like that. Y'all don't know me, okay? Y'all don't know me. Let me be great. So I get into UMBC, and I had applied to work in this lab with Dr. Danielle Beatty-Moody. Shout out to Dr. Beatty, who was doing phenomenal research on racial trauma and its impact on sleep quality as well as blood pressure. So for me, it was a fit because she was focused on racial trauma. That's the story that I wove in terms of applying to her lab and working in her lab. So while I'm in her lab, that was a lot of what the research was. It was called the social determinants of social determinants of health inequities. There we go. And so a lot of what that was focused on is what happens when people experience discrimination. How does it affect their health? How does it affect their social functioning? And how does it affect their psychological functioning? UMBC allowed me to defend my master's thesis from Loyola at UMBC, so that I ended up getting my master's at UMBC. So funny, I finished all the coursework for a master's at Loyola, but couldn't pass the comps, transferred all my things to UMBC, and was able to take transfer my thesis over, take the qualifying exams, and then get the master's and then get the PhD over there. So UMBC is now where I'm now throwing all my weight and effort into. And remember, I said during my bachelor's degree, I used to write a lot of my papers and make them focus on anything to do with Black women's experience. Whatever the topic was, I made sure that I studied Black women. Whatever the paper was, I wrote it on Black women. Whatever the assignment was, I wrote it on Black women. So by the time I get to Beatty's lab, I really was now an expert in Black women's mental health, really and truly, how they cope with racial and trauma, as well as, to some extent, some gender violence and intimate partner violence. As I progressed in my training, I started to add more components of adversity. I think there were some assignments that just wouldn't lend themselves to racial and ethnic discrimination, so I expanded it to other forms of oppression, right? In comes the addressing model, which talks about the social construct of power and how your dimension of identity determines what the social construct of power. So addressing stands for age, disability, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexuality or sex, indigenous status, nation of origin, and gender. So I ended up just really being good at studying oppression among all of the dimensions of diversity. And so even to this day, when folks have dissertation focused on any of those marginalized communities, they're asking me to be on it because I happen to have studied that and know that really well. And still an interest in spirituality. But if you listen to my other video where I talk about my journey, I was no longer focused on Christianity, but I was integrating spirituality, right? You know, when people talk about, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, it's like, you got by the new age, woo. But that's where I was at. And the PhD program really lends itself well to that kind of identity, and really, draws people in with that. So I was just really trying to integrate spirituality without necessarily being about Christianity. Anyway, fast forward, I ended up switching labs into Kenneth Matten's lab, and he is a community psychologist. So that is how I picked up the community psychology track as well. And a lot of what he did was program evaluation, program development, program evaluation, as well as some things on racial and ethnic discrimination, education outcomes among racial ethnic minorities. And so I just picked up that because that's his lab, that's the research he's doing, and I'm now in his lab. I ended up switching out of clinical psychology for a hot minute. And during that time, I really threw everything into studying community psychology. I even took a program evaluation class where they had us actually evaluate a real program. So I did gain some program evaluation experience, evaluating a program within the community. I didn't mention that I did have previous work experience doing program evaluation, but at a very low level, right? So now I am the principal investigator here running the evaluation based on my training thus far. And so I did then decide to come back to clinical psych because that's truly where my heart was, and I wasn't happy just only being community. And so I needed to find a placement to reintegrate to do clinical work. And I didn't even talk about how I stopped doing clinical psych. I had the misfortune of ending up at a placement that just was not a good fit, and it ended up doing more harm then good. And I'll talk about that in another setting. I want to just keep focused on what my training was. But that was a religious setting where I was trying to learn and understand how to integrate religious practices with psychology, and then got burned. So I'm like, look, I'm trying here, but why isn't it working? Granted, it was not a Christian religion, and so there's a lot to be said about that and whatever that means. But needless to say, I took a break from clinical and then decided to come back to clinical, and I ended up finding a private practice and working with Harriet Wims, who was a phenomenal clinician who actually happened to be trained in Kenneth Matten's lab as well. So we had a lot of the same orientation in terms of our worldview, our training, our academic experience, and we're both mentored by Ken. So we're basically, and she's a Black woman, right? So we're basically the same. And I really modeled a lot of my clinical training and background after her, because she sort of nurtured me back into clinical, is what I like to say. And she was also religious. I won't say what her religion was, but she was pretty high up in there. And so oftentimes we talked about spirituality in our case conceptualization, and she even helped me. She taught me how to interpret dreams, right? And integrate that into therapy and all of that in terms of conceptualizing a person, identifying latent content versus manifest content. Mind-blowing. Had no idea. But she was really instrumental in showing me that you could integrate those things. Again, I'm still not yet back into Christianity because I'd gone through a deconstruction process, but still trying to find a way to say God is the way, but just not knowing how. Anyway, I finished my training with Harriet. I finished my Ph.D. program. I graduate. Along the way, what are some of the experiences that I got? I also did a psychology teaching fellowship. And this was a fellowship where they taught you how to be a professor, right? Have you ever taken a college class where you're like, oh, this is so boring. I have no idea what we're talking about. What is the assignment? You just are trying to get out. A lot of times professors aren't taught how to teach, actually. Like, nobody actually teaches professors how to teach. You have the knowledge, teach it, right? And so people just do whatever. This training program really focused on the pedagogy of delivering information, identifying your objective, how you are going to reach, what kind of medium you're going to engage, and what are the expected outcomes. And so I really learned how to teach through that fellowship. And I think I did it for 2 years. And the first year I taught Intro to Psychology. And then my second year I taught Psychology and Culture. Do you know that my very first class that I ever taught had 250 students in an auditorium? When I tell you that I was sick, my stomach was in a knot. I was clutching the podium the whole time, like I'm white knuckling it. By the time I got done, there was indents in my fingers from clutching so hard. How could that be the first class you give me? Needless to say, I remember I'd be so anxious before teaching each class. I sometimes had to call my mom. And I remember my mom sometimes go, "Did you eat?" "Okay, just take a deep breath." And she would talk me through it. And it's so sweet. And now look, I be teaching without even a thought. But yeah, I had to learn it. And Dr. Eileen O'Brien, brilliant professor, she would come and observe my classes and then write me like a feedback report on how I did. My goodness. So it was a rich training experience in terms of how I came to be where I'm at. And so for the rest of my PhD journey, I actually was adjunct teaching at a number of different universities locally. So I taught at intimacy and relationships at University of Baltimore. I taught aggression and violence at Trinity Washington University, some intro to psychology classes. And then we transitioned to online during COVID. And so I learned how to deliver content and teach effectively during COVID, like many of us did, like you just had to do it. And it's interesting because I remember that they used to, the class was like meeting twice a week. And I was like, man, we gonna meet once a week and then the other stuff will be virtual. So, and this was the spring of 2020. So I was inadvertently already preparing for virtual without actually knowing that we'd be virtual. And that worked out beautifully because I was like, say less, okay? And so that was a really easy transition for me. And so other things that I experienced in terms of my training, let's see. So I also had the opportunity to run a lab. So when I was in the SODI lab, I did actually run the lab. I hired research assistants, and there was ongoing studies that I actually recruited participants and ran the study, entered the data, analyze the data, write papers, do poster presentations and things like that. And so fully proficient in the research experience and have done a ton of research, again, related to overcoming and coping with adversity specifically. And so my final dissertation project was focused on how Black women cope with adversity, once again, but this time the adversity I was focused on was sexual re-victimization. And sexual re-victimization is the idea that you are victimized once, you are 2 times more likely to be victimized the second time. So it's a phenomena that's known, that anybody that is victimized once is likely to be victimized again. Particularly if you're victimized in childhood, you're twice as likely to be re-victimized in adolescence or adulthood. If you're victimized in adolescence, also likely to be re-victimized in adulthood. Victimized in adulthood, likely to be victimized again in adulthood. So that's what sexual re-victimization is. And I was trying to understand the mechanism that leads people to experience multiple victimizations. And I utilized the RRR framework, read, react, respond model, right? That talks about when you experience that initial victimization, it compromises, that's a trauma. It compromises a lot of your biological, psychological, and social functions and your ability to now, in the future, anticipate and avoid danger. Obviously, I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but really understanding how adversity affects you and how you then trauma affects you. So the negative sequelae associated with trauma. And so I finished that research. So it's focused on sexual re-victimization, how Black women, what was the title? Rates of depression among Black women who have been who have experienced sexual re-victimization, and the moderating effects of education and sense of control. There goes that sense of control again. And the reason I did education was because Ken's lab focused on education, right? If I was in another lab, I would have picked some other construct. And so obviously Black women, sexual re-victimization, and all of that was new for Ken, but he was on my previous project on locus of control, and he has expertise in education, and he does focus a lot of his work on the African American experience. So it worked out. He was a good sport about it, and had a bunch of other amazing faculty on there that really made the project what it was and brought it together in a phenomenal way. In my final year at my program, I actually missed the deadline to apply for internship by 2 weeks. Oh boy. And so it meant I had to sit out a year. And so I chose to go to Zimbabwe for that 1 year that I was off. And I decided to still work and do a 1 year practicum as an advanced doctoral student and supervise other students. So my practicum that year, I supervised other students. And a supervision practicum means that you get supervision of supervision, right? You're supervising other people, but you're taught how to supervise. So I've had multiple experience on how to lead people, how to teach people, and how to manage people with lots and lots of guidance and lots of evaluation and oversight. So I'm in Zimbabwe for a year. I'm finishing off my dissertation, and I'm doing this supervision practicum. And then I came back to the U.S. and I finished my internship. Now my internship was at the Falk Center for Counseling, FAULK, Falk Center for Counseling in Boca Raton, Florida. And of course I would pick Boca. Did not know what Boca was until I got there. I was like, oh boy. It was super expensive to live there. So I ended up actually living in Fort Lauderdale and commuting. It was also very expensive just to live there in general, and internship doesn't pay a lot. So I ended up doing rideshare to supplement my income. I would finish internship during the day, and then I would do rideshare at night. And so I actually learned a lot because internship is like an intensive of your therapy experience, right? But the rideshare ended up being that I'm picking up all these people, I'm talking to people in the car, but I have to forget about them once they get out of the car. One of the challenges I used to have as a therapist is I would be thinking about my clients over and over again. I couldn't even make myself stop. Please stop thinking about them, right? But when I did the ride share, once you drop that person off, you can't wonder how that lovely couple is, right? So it ended up being beneficial for me, even just in terms of interacting with people, talking to difficult people, and even just humility, right? Here I am getting my PhD, months away from my PhD, but having to do rideshare, and people don't always treat service workers very well. So it was an intense period, I'll say that. Needless to say, I finished my program, I graduated, and now comes postdoc. And it's always a surprise for many of us in our program after we graduate that we got to do postdoc, right? Because I think in my program, I felt like postdoc was like, oh, where you get to do extra research. And of course I would think that. I came from a PhD program, research heavy. But no, it was that you need these postdoc hours in order to get licensed. And if you don't get them, there's some states that don't require postdoc license hours. And it's like, well, do I want to skip over getting postdoc and then end up in a state that requires postdoc in a few years and have to do a postdoc again? Okay, you know what? Let's just go ahead and do it. We'll just go ahead and do it and get it out the way. So I applied for postdoc in Virginia because I wanted to be near my kids. And I had been looking and searching, and there weren't really anything coming up. And there was one at the Hampton VA, and I was going to do that, but I just really didn't want to get into another structured system like that. And then AP comes up, just clear out of nowhere, this job. And when the person interviewed me, she was like, you're perfect for this position, your background and your experience. And I didn't know how or why she was saying that. But now that I was like, oh, that's why she was excited about me. But this place ended up focusing on PTSD, particularly those that have experienced, sexual trauma, combat trauma, any kind of violence and things like that, and really teaching me how to conceptualize trauma. Like, I have become a trauma expert by virtue of the postdoc. And then another thing that we focused on is also forensic work. So this is doing evaluations that are court ordered on individuals who are in danger of losing their kids to foster care or have some kind of CPS case going. And so a lot of times they tend to have a lot of trauma as well. And so I ended up having started off interested in racial trauma, expanding into other kinds of trauma, and then really, really, really specializing in trauma in ways that I didn't expect at AP, and really honing that skill of being able to identify what trauma looks like, how trauma impacts functioning both in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and how people cope with that and or don't, right? What are the negative sequelae associated with that? And so all of that to say that my journey, my academic journey, almost seems or feels like it was really divinely orchestrated, because I wouldn't have known how to pick the things the way that I did. I mean, I've talked about how I almost just stumbled into psychology, stumbled into this lab, didn't get into that lab, like all of these things, right? And so now, having spent so much time learning about oppression, it makes sense to me that I would come and be at this place where I now support and help people through experiences of spiritual oppression. We don't study spiritual oppression in psychology. And yet, many people are spiritually bound and spiritually oppressed. It's almost as if I learned about oppression so that I had the groundwork or the foundation to then apply the concepts of spiritual oppression to then help people get free from that. Remember I talked about empowerment? Remember I talked about socialization? Remember I talked about coping, sense of control, spirituality? All of these things all converged to this one place. I wasn't even saved again. I had been going through a deconstruction process, so I couldn't have known that this would be for the benefit of the kingdom. In my last video, I said, I feel like Paul. I'm going to evoke that again, because Paul was the most Pharisee that ever Phariseed. Okay, he was the Phariseest Pharisee that ever Phariseed. He knew his stuff. Okay, he knew the law. He knew everything, and yet that background ended up being the thing that God used to glorify his name and to have him preach the gospel. And so I feel like it's the same thing with my background and my experience. Who knew that this would lead to me becoming a deliverance minister with a psychology background? So obviously you have to listen to the other video to understand how I came into deliverance. And so my next video is going to talk about how I combine those two concepts, how I marry psychology and deliverance together to create my unique framework that really helps to set people free. I hope that this was helpful and beneficial in whatever way. Feel free to send me comments and questions if there's any extra clarity or information that you'd like about my training. I'll probably even just upload my resume to my website, because that I think also will be beneficial if you want to just be able to peruse what that background is, because I think it is relevant. People absolutely must talk about their backgrounds. You can search up my transcript and you can get it. You can search up my dissertation, you'll find it. All right. I hope that this was a blessing to you all, and that you all learned something, understand a little bit more about me and how I operate. I pray that this was a blessing, and I will catch you on the next one.